Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be giving an update on Israel and the Middle East to understand some of the complexities that are taking place across the region. Well, welcome to the programme, and today's special guest is all the way from North London. His name is Jonathan Hoffman. He's a Jewish blogger and also a tireless campaigner on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people. Jonathan, it's always a pleasure to have you on the Middle East Report, and thank you so much for helping me get some exceptional guests for the Middle East Report. So I really appreciate that, and really appreciate your endless dedication to defending Israel and your Jewish community as well. So it's a pleasure having you on the programme. Do you want to give us a little bit of an update on some of the challenges facing the Jewish community, particularly your blog, which is called On the Dark Side, where you really do defend the Jewish community and Israel on that blog?
Sure. Well, the main topic of conversation, bone of contention, whatever you want to call it at the moment, is the judicial reform in Israel. And that has produced some quite strong arguments on both sides. We can talk about the whys and the wherefores later, but I've always felt that as somebody who doesn't live in Israel, it really wasn't up to me to comment on Israel's internal policies. But when the Prime Minister Netanyahu came to London, there was very strong lobbying to Rishi Sunak to criticise him for the judicial reforms. And I personally was a supporter of the judicial reform, so I had no choice but to enter into the debate. And that debate has been raging, and although there was a pause during Passover, during Pesach, over the holidays, the debate still rages on. I think that's the main topic of the day. And of course, the BBC, as ever, the BBC's misreporting remains an issue. And as we're coming in the UK towards the 2024 election, there'll be a debate as to the stance of the political parties on Israel. You remember that the last election we had, Corbyn was the leader, and the manifesto, Labour Party's manifesto on Israel was really very, very bad. It talked about arms embargoes on Israel and so on. And we hope under Keir Starmer that things will have improved, but we've yet to see what the manifesto has. So those are the sorts of things that people are talking about. And of course, the recent coronation as well was very much at the forefront of our minds, welcoming the new king. Absolutely.
So if we talk about the coronation, for example, I mean, this is the biggest state occasion that we've witnessed in decades. This is the first coronation of a monarch that we've seen since Queen Elizabeth II in June 1953, and not many of us are around to actually witness that. But can you share with us your thoughts on the Jewish community's reaction to the coronation of King Charles III?
Well, we have a command in the Bible to support whichever government where we're living outside Israel and the diaspora. So the Jewish community is, I think, generally very supportive of the monarchy as an institution. The late Queen was very close to the late Chief Rabbi, Lord Sachs, and Charles apparently is close to the current Chief Rabbi. So there are really very close connections, although Charles is the head of the Church of England as well, but he says he wants to be not just the defender of the faith, but the defender of faiths with an S. We've yet to see how that works out. I mean, my biggest question, quite honestly, is when will the king agree to a state visit to Israel? Because
Absolutely.
It was very noticeable that the Queen never undertook a state visit to Israel in all her years, and I personally think that was really, really unfortunate. People say that it was at the behest of the Foreign Office, but what is the point of being the monarch if you can't say to the Foreign Office, I'm sorry, I'm going? Israel is a close ally. In the recent Yom Ha'atzmaut celebrations, Independence Day celebrations in Israel, the RAF for the first time took part in those celebrations. The relations are incredibly close. The monarch, the Queen, went to most of the countries in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, whose human rights record is questionable. Why on earth did she never go to Israel? It's a great disappointment to me and to many others in the Jewish community. And we're waiting with bated breath for Charles to announce the first state visit to Israel. I know he's been as a prince, I know William has been, I know the late Duke of Edinburgh went, but the monarch has never been on an official state visit. And that is really, really appalling, quite honestly. I can't think of a stronger word.
No, I agree with you, particularly Queen Elizabeth, who had a strong Christian faith as well, and Israel is the birthplace of Christianity, so not to be able to visit the Holy Land, not to see Israel on an official state visit, probably would have been one of the big regrets of her long reign. But if we go back to the coronation itself, were you pleased to see that your chief rabbi was actually involved in the coronation and actually representing the Jewish community? And what does that mean for you, and what does that mean for the rest of the British Jewish community?
Well, I think it's very important. The coronation was on a Saturday, which is a Jewish Sabbath, but and although Jews are not supposed to enter into churches, when it's a question, when the monarch is involved, there is a dispensation. They are allowed to enter into churches. And the chief rabbi, I think, stayed the night somewhere near Buckingham Palace, and he would have walked to the church. It was great to see that. There was Jewish participation in the service as well. So yeah, I think everybody welcomed that.
Excellent. And also I think it's very important as well for our non-Jewish viewers watching this programme today to realise that at Jewish synagogues or shuls and many services, there are actually, the British flag is on parade, and there's an actual prayer for the monarchy and the government. We pray
for the royal family every Saturday, every Shabbat. So yeah, yes, there's, the Jewish community is incredibly loyal to the monarch. That's not to say there aren't people who support republicanism. There are people who think that the hereditary monarchy is not in tune with the modern day. But generally, whilst there is a monarchy, I think the Jewish community is very supportive.
Absolutely. And what do you think it will mean to not only British Jewry, but also to Israel, that if King Charles III is able to visit Israel as king, rather than as the Prince of Wales, and to see Israel within his role as monarch, what would that mean for Anglo-Israeli relations?
I really hope I see it in my lifetime. It would be absolutely fantastic. He would get a phenomenal welcome in Israel. People would be absolutely delighted. I'm sure, the way that protocol works is that you don't issue an invitation unless you're sure it's going to be accepted. So, but I see no reason why, why not go? It's not a question of security. If the American president can go, why can the head of state of the UK not go? It's not. It's something which is incomprehensible, I think within the next 5 years, or maybe 6 or 7 years, it probably will happen. But of course, the first place he would go would be Yad Vashem. That's where all the Holocaust Memorial. That's where all foreign dignitaries go. Yeah, it would be tremendous, and he would get a fantastic welcome. And I mean, Prince Philip's, the late Prince Philip's grandmother, I think, is buried on the Mount of Olives, and there are a lot of connections with the UK, of course, under the mandate, the British mandate, which ended in 1940. A lot of British connections, a lot of people who were born in Britain and are now citizens of Israel. It would be phenomenal. It really would be, and we look forward to it hugely.
Absolutely. I mean, it'd be great if he can make it for Israel's 80th anniversary. I think that would be very special. But also share with us, Jonathan, the fact that we're seeing a lot of high-profile American political dignitaries visit Israel. We've recently had Ron DeSantis visit Israel, one of the leading Republican candidates for president for the 2024 election. We've seen the Speaker of the House. And share with us how Israel will become more and more important as we head closer to that crucial presidential election in 2024.
Well, I think Israel is important in terms of foreign policy. Israel has always been careful to cultivate bipartisan support with both the Democrats and the Republicans. And it's not just Jewish voters who, in the US, who the candidates are trying to connect with. It's also the very many Christian supporters of Israel in the US. So I think Israel is important. If you look at the reception that Israeli leaders get in Congress, it's absolutely phenomenal. Reception from the president is sometimes cool. I mean, the relations with Obama were notoriously not so good. In fact, Obama, I think, or the Obama regime was critical of Netanyahu. They felt that Netanyahu was overtly supporting Trump against the Democrats, which wasn't true. Netanyahu has always been scrupulously careful to be politically neutral as far as U.S. Domestic affairs are concerned. So, Israel is very important in foreign policy terms, and you're seeing that in terms of the candidates visiting at the moment.
Yep. So let's have a look now at the latest high-profile visit of a US politician, and this is the Speaker of the House in Congress visiting Israel on a state occasion.
Speaker Kevin McCarthy came at the invitation of Israel's Speaker of the Knesset, Amir Ohana. Together, they reviewed an honor guard and laid a wreath in memory of the fallen soldier. Beyond the ceremonies here at the Knesset, Speaker McCarthy reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to prevent the Islamic Republic of Iran from becoming a nuclear power.
As we stand shoulder to shoulder against Iran's regional aggression, we must always remain resolute in our commitment that Iran will never acquire a nuclear weapon.
McCarthy's speech came just days after Israel celebrated their 70th anniversary, and he celebrated how the nation's birth fulfilled biblical prophecy.
The prophet Isaiah predicted a brighter future to come. Inspired by God, he shared this command: arise, shine, thy light to come. My friends, today, 75 years after declaring independence, Israel's lights shine brighter than ever before. Ladies and gentlemen, Israel's rebirth is nothing less than a modern miracle, and I thank you for it.
McCarthy said the U.S. House of Representatives recently passed a bipartisan resolution celebrating both the anniversary and the Abraham Accords, while also warning the #1 threat to Israel and those accords is Iran. During a news conference following his speech, CBN News asked the Speaker about U.S. military cooperation with Israel against Iran. You made a commitment in your speech that the U.S. will not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. Right now, there's a sense here in Israel sometimes they may have to go it alone. Would you recommend to the administration that would join Israel militarily if they have to?
An armed nuclear Iran is not a safe place to be for the world. And I think it's very clear with the people behind me as well. We will never stand to allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon.
During this visit, McCarthy also met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He told a Hebrew publication that if President Biden doesn't invite Netanyahu to Washington, he will. Former Israeli ambassador to the UN and Knesset member Danny Danon told CBN News the threat of Iran is a major reason Netanyahu needs to be at the White House.
The American people should be worried about nuclear Iran the same way we are worried about it. It's a global effort, and I expect that President Biden will invite Prime Minister Netanyahu to the White House to discuss those issues. It must happen ASAP.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, the Knesset, Jerusalem.
And of course, we see that Israel will become increasingly more important and more significant to US politicians as we draw closer to November 2024 US presidential election. Jonathan, of course, we are going to talk in this program about Israel's judicial reform and how that's bringing division within Israeli society. But there's nothing that unites Israel and the Jewish people more than confronting the threat posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran, i.e. them having nuclear weapons.
This remains a perennial concern, and the rhetoric coming out from Iran is very scary. That was a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans in the US. The Democrats sponsored the Iran agreement, which to my mind would have led inexorably to a nuclear bomb in Tehran. Trump dropped that pretty quickly. Biden, they talk about the Iran agreement, but nothing seems to happen in resurrecting that. I mean, people will be wanting to know what the policies are of the Democrats in particular coming into the 24 US election.
But it's not long, is it? I mean, the clock is ticking, and it seems it's only a question of time before the Islamic Republic of Iran reaches breakout. So it's imperative, isn't it, that we see that Republicans in the US as well as Israel stand united against the Iranian nuclear threat.
Absolutely.
Jonathan, I just want also moving on to probably the biggest political topic in Israel for a generation, and that's the issue of the judicial reform. It's been proposed by Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing and religious government. Just unpack for us what is actually proposed in reforming the judiciary system in Israel, and why is it a major problem when it comes to interference within Israeli government policy?
The Supreme Court in Israel has become very powerful, not by any law, but there was a Supreme Court president called Aharon Barak, who seized is maybe the wrong word, but he took a lot of power of the Supreme Court initially over things in the basic law, which is Israel's, it's not a constitution, but it's the bedrock of the law in Israel. And then going on to human rights questions. And the Supreme Court, in theory, although it never has done so, can even veto political appointments. It could even veto a Prime Minister of Israel as well. And it's been the policy of every government to do something about the power of the Supreme Court. And there have been instances where the Supreme Court has produced rulings which one might question, but it's like a nuclear deterrent. It's not so much what the Supreme Court has done, but it's the knowledge that the Supreme Court could overturn pieces of legislation. So the current government said it was going to do something, and it now wants to do something, and it's very controversial, especially amongst the voters who did not vote for Netanyahu. They see this in some sense as a way of destabilizing the current government. It's important that there is judicial reform. Some say that the government may have acted too quickly and too precipitously. But if you look, for example, at the committee that appoints judges in Israel, it's a committee of 9 people. And if there is a government of the left, it has an automatic majority because it has the justice minister on the committee, the cabinet minister who would be from the left. There's 2 Knesset members, one from the government, one from the opposition, 3 Supreme Court judges who would support what the Supreme Court's doing, 2 Bar Association representatives who would automatically support the Supreme Court judges. So with a left-wing government, the left has an automatic majority on that committee. if it's a right-wing government, the right wing would only have 3 votes of those 9 on that committee. It would have the 2 ministers and the member of the Knesset on the right, and it would have to dispute, fight, negotiate for every single issue that the committee was looking at. So there's an obvious imbalance in that appointment, and one of the elements of the judicial reform is to try to deal with that. And another is to say that if the Supreme Court vetoed a piece of legislation, then the Knesset could come back, and with a Knesset majority, which I think is 61, of the next Knesset, could overturn the Supreme Court's veto.
Which sounds quite reasonable in itself, and if you know anything about Israeli politics, the Supreme Court does take precedent over the Prime Minister's legislation and decisions he makes when it comes to security, when it comes to internal issues within Israel. And of course, any Prime Minister wants to leave a legacy behind, which the Supreme Court could veto if it decides it doesn't like it. No one votes for the Supreme Court, the judges on the Supreme Court, do they? They're also they're unelected and unaccountable. But surely the big issue is the fact that many of the secular Israelis see the judicial reform as a prospect, particularly from this kind of ultra-nationalist government we've got of belonging to Benjamin Netanyahu, of actually then bring about a Jewish theocracy and bring in kind of more religious laws governing Shabbat, going over kosher food, over wearing of certain clothing, and that they hold their secular freedoms extremely highly. So share with us how this is also not only a battle between the right and the left, but also a battle between the secular and the religious, and the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi.
It's a battle between the Ashkenazi and Sephardi. The Ashkenazi have always been in the elite of Israeli society, with some exceptions, but generally that's true. And my friends who are Ashkenazi Jews in Israel are all against the reform. It's a battle between the religious and the secular, because the religious parties do have a say in the current government. I mean, there was a case over Passover where the state at the moment is that hospitals in Israel don't have to. They can make the choice, or they can have food which wasn't suitable for Passover. But one of the reforms says that hospital managers should have the right, if they want to say that their hospitals have to have food which is appropriate for Passover. And it's those kind of religious questions which are in hot dispute. But the opponents of the reform, to my mind, have gone completely off the wall. I mean, the granddaughter of the Shimon Peres, the late president, her name is Mika Almog, and I've seen a video which she made, and about 9 times in that video she says, "The ground is burning, the ground is burning," as if there was some kind of conflagration which was going to burn Israel up, as if there was an attack from Iran, God forbid. They've gone completely over the top, to my mind. How it'll play out, I don't know. People talk about compromise, but there hasn't any attempt at compromise so far has been, has not been successful. But the government has dropped has postponed the reform for the moment, but it will come back, and it needs to come back. I mean, politicians should make the law, not judges. Judges are there to interpret the law, to decide cases. They're not there to make the law. And to me, it seems perfectly sensible to separate the turf between politicians and judges. Judges interpret the law, politicians make the law. And what is not sensible about that?
No, well, it makes perfect sense, but this has caused something like 80,000 people to demonstrate in the streets of Tel Aviv and other streets against the judicial reform. So the kind of big question is, can the government reach a consensus? can they reach a consensus with the left and the other political parties to come up with a compromise where everyone will be happy, obviously apart from the actual issue itself?
It's not a question of everyone being happy, it's a question of how to minimise the unhappiness of both sides. But I don't know. I mean, so far, as you know, as we talk at this time, it hasn't been successful. But who knows what will happen? I mean, there's a lot of pressure, both from inside Israel and from outside Israel. And one of the reasons that Netanyahu dropped the reform or put it on hold was, I think, pressure from outside Israel. I mean, when he was here in London, the opponents of the reform were successful in getting Rishi Sunak in a statement to be kind of slightly critical of what was happening, which I thought was wrong, because it's an internal Israeli matter. Absolutely. And it's not up to the British government to get involved, quite honestly.
And of course we've seen Biden getting involved as well. But share with us the importance. I mean, we're seeing arguments that Israel's democracy is under threat, that Israel's freedom is under threat by this judicial reform. And we're seeing that clearly also a lot of this judicial reform and the protests that we've seen on the streets of Tel Aviv and other places like that are pretty much used to destabilize this government and also bring about a change of government as well. So that's obviously one of the interior motives behind these huge demonstrations, as well as how these reforms will actually be interpreted on whichever Israeli camp that you are actually in, whether you're Ashkenazi, Sephardi, religious, secular, right or left.
The notion that this reform will destroy democracy is like Alice through the looking glass. You know, what is democratic about judges making laws? It's not. It's anti-democratic. It's not democratic. To me, it's bizarre that they say it's democratic. And I mean, people who say that Israel is becoming not democratic. I mean, Israel has had 5 elections in the last 4 years. What is not democratic about that? It's not. I mean, some people say Israel is excessively democratic and it should be less democratic, and they want to raise the threshold for parties to win seats in the Knesset from whatever, I think it's 3.5%, and they want to raise it to 5%. So, you know, if anything, there's too much democracy in Israel.
Yeah. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN news item that explains what's behind a lot of the demonstrations and protests we're seeing with the Israeli government's proposal to reform Israel's judiciary.
Nearly 12 weeks of protests in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and other cities intensified after Prime Minister Netanyahu fired his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, on Sunday. Gallant, from Netanyahu's own Likud party, defied the prime minister in a nationwide speech on Saturday, calling for a halt to negotiations over judicial reform before the Passover break in less than 2 weeks. Israel's President Isaac Herzog also called for calm and a halt to negotiations. Today, Histadrut, the nation's largest union, called for a nationwide strike, and flights were canceled Monday at Israel's Ben Gurion Airport. They aim to shut the country down. For weeks, the opposition has charged that the coalition's judicial reforms go too far and will bring about the end of Israeli democracy.
We need to cancel this judicial reform, to remove it completely, and to think together how we are ensuring a better future for all citizens of Israel.
Yet some believe it's about much more than judicial reform.
I think if it had been about judicial reform, we would have seen it in October before the elections were happening. But what was it about back then? It was about Netanyahu and getting him out of office. The opposition people now, they're the ones who are saying, we've got to get him out. No matter what kind of alliance we make, we've got to get him out of office. So that's really the central point.
100% the attempt here is to throw Netanyahu's government and to get back to have the left ruling with the immunity that it will get from the Supreme Court.
Israeli Middle East expert Amir Sephardi believes powerful interests want to maintain the power of the Supreme Court.
You're touching somebody's asset and he won't let it go, and therefore they're billionaires, owners of big companies, big tech companies, bank owners, all of these people with the aid, and of course what they do, they're painting a very terrible picture of Israel becoming dictatorship.
Sephardi says the protests are extremely well funded, with an agenda to topple the government.
First of all, the amount of money that is being poured into that is, I've never seen anything like that before. We're talking about funding that is in a state level. This is not the common person.
Coalition has wanted to finish voting on judicial reform by the beginning of the one-month recess, Passover recess, which begins on April 5th. But for now, the crisis here in Israel is literally changing by the hour.
So, Chris, how are things going right now?
Well, right now, Ephraim, we're literally waiting for Netanyahu to make a decision. Is he going to pause the legislation? And some people think that might be a capitulation. Gallant, the defense minister, wanted to pause. The chief rabbi actually just came out just a little while ago. He's asking for a pause. He says what's happening right now is hurting the heart. The danger for Netanyahu right now, if he pauses the legislation, that some of his Knesset coalition partners are threatening to leave the coalition. That's we've heard Ben Gvir, he's part of the religious party in one of the religious parties in the Knesset. Now, if he pulls out, that really could threaten the government. So right now, Netanyahu's trying to balance what's going on, whether or not he's going to pause this legislation or go ahead.
And of course, we've seen that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has paused that legislation on the eve of Passover, but no doubt that will come back soon, as it's the #1 big political issue in Israel. I suppose the question we have to ask, don't we, Jonathan, as Israel supporters and viewing Israel from the UK, is what are the dangers for Israeli democracy and society if the judiciary is not reformed, and that they will continue to have the power to veto Israeli government legislation, who themselves are unelected and unaccountable?
Well, I think there are many dangers. I mean, there are dangers in security terms. If the government wants to do something to do with the army and the Supreme Court rules it illegal, then security could suffer. And there have been a couple of instances where security has suffered. But when you come down to it, it should be the politicians, however unstable the governments are in Israel, however much there is argument within the coalition, it is the politicians who should be making the policy and not the judges. The opponents of the reform make comparisons with the UK. They say, well, we don't have a second House of Parliament in Israel. You have the House of Lords. To which my response is, well, the House of Lords can detain legislation, but it can't block legislation. And with financial legislation, it can't do anything. So, the House of Lords is not exactly powerful. And they point to the US, where there's separation of powers. There's the executive, the Supreme Court, and the Congress, and they say that's a check and balance. But I mean, look at what's happened with abortion, where the President Trump managed to put conservative judges on the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against abortion. And now there are several states where you can't have abortion. So having checks and balances is not a surefire way to prevent having policies which might be unpopular. But
what are the dangers for Israel? I mean, we're seeing really the biggest internal divisions in Israel since the 73 Yom Kippur War. We know that there are divisions in Israel because we mentioned them. The difference between the Ashkenazi Israelis and the Sephardi Israelis. Can you explain to our viewers the different groups of the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi, which I think is a very important factor?
Well, the Ashkenazim are essentially the descendants of European Jews, and it was the Ashkenazim originally who built the country. The Sephardim are the descendants of the Jews who were thrown out of Spain at the time of the Inquisition, and the Jews from the Middle East, from Iraq and Iran and those places. And for a long time, and Yemen, and for a long time, certainly at the start of the state, the Sephardim were the underdogs, and they had reason to complain. There was even the Israeli equivalent of a Black Panther group, which were militant Sephardi group. Today there are Sephardim descendants of the Middle East Jews in powerful positions in the Supreme Court, in the civil service, and everywhere. So, you know, the divisions between Ashkenazim and Sephardim are still there, but they were nowhere near as great as they once were. But I mean, you asked, Simon, about the risk to Israel. I mean, and of course, when Iran sees a country which is divided, then it's more tempting to attack, because you think that the minds of the people who are supervising defence and who are in the army, their minds are going to be somewhere else. And we've already seen there was a case with an IDF group who wouldn't go to their training. They protested against the judicial reform by not training. And if you have the sort of seeds of a rebellion within the IDF, I mean, that's incredibly dangerous for Israel. Of course it is.
Including pilots as well in the Israeli Air Force.
Including pilots,
well.
yes.
So let's have a look at this CBN news item where Benjamin Netanyahu halts the reform of Israel's judiciary.
In his address, Netanyahu cited King Solomon and the wisdom of splitting the baby in two, and said he wanted to avoid splitting the nation in two.
When there's an opportunity to avoid civil war through dialogue, I, as Prime Minister, am taking a time for dialogue. I give a real opportunity for a real dialogue. We insist on the need to bring about the necessary corrections in the legal system, and we're given an opportunity to achieve a broad consensus. This is a very worthy goal.
After the address, Israeli President Isaac Herzog asked Netanyahu and opposition leaders Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid to work together to find a compromise. They agreed.
We will show up at the president's residence. We will extend our hand. I call on Netanyahu to take away the threats, ultimatums, and extreme statements that keep us away from the goal. Stop everything and send relevant teams to the president's residence. We will work to strengthen democracy, improve governance, and maintain the independence of the judicial system.
The White House applauded Netanyahu's decision.
Democratic societies are strengthened by checks and balances, and fundamental changes to a democratic system should be pursued with the broadest possible base of popular support. And so that's what we're going to continue to call for.
Yet proponents of the legislation said the law was designed to bring a check and balance on what they called Israel's runaway judiciary, arguing that the judicial system has had little or no restraint on it for decades. And many saw nearly 12 weeks of street protests as an attempt not just to win the debate over judicial reform, but to topple the government with accusations of the end of democracy and a dictatorship.
I don't remember that at the time that the levels of hatred were this violent, were this supported by the media, were driven by the media.
Israeli commentator Carolyn Glick says the intense internal strife put Israel in peril in light of Israel's #1 threat in the region, Iran.
People who don't want Israel to take action against Iran, of all stripes and sizes, would want Israel to be submerged in domestic rioting and discord to make it impossible as a practical matter for the army, for the government, for our intelligence arms to concentrate and focus on the task at hand, which is taking out a sufficient percentage of Iran's nuclear capabilities to keep them off the ability to develop a nuclear arsenal.
As Israelis look forward to celebrating the Passover and the miracle of the Israelites' deliverance from their slavery in Egypt, many hope and pray Israel's leaders will experience a deliverance from one of the worst domestic crises in the history of modern Israel. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Great report as ever there by Chris Mitchell from CBN. Jonathan, I mean, many people have looked at Israel's political situation and yeah, it's a very, very vibrant democracy. Israel's a very vibrant society, saying that Israel needs political stability. So therefore, wouldn't it be an idea to replace Israel's voting system, which is currently proportional representation, with a more stable political system? Why do you think this will not work well for Israel?
There are good arguments and bad arguments for first past the post, which we have in the UK, and there are good arguments and bad arguments for proportional representation. Neither system is ideal. With first past the post, you have the Liberal Democrats who get a far bigger share of the vote than they have the numbers of seats. and first past the post favours regional. Well, it's good if you're a regional party, but if you're a national minority party, it's bad, like the Liberal Democrats. But you have an MP who represents you. You know who your MP is. In Israel, the threshold, it's proportional representation, and the Israelis don't know who represents them. It's a party list system, so you don't know who is going to be your Knesset member. And people are very critical of some of the people in the Knesset and in the government at the moment. But the advantage of proportional representation is it is proportional. So with a country like Israel, which has so many different ethnic factions, the Ashkenazim, the Sephardim, the Arabs, the Christians, the Russians, proportional representation seems to me to be ideal, because every part of that population can have representation. You can argue about the threshold. I think it's 3.25%. Is that a fair threshold? Is that too low a threshold for a party to enter the Knesset? And there is a good argument that it should be up to 4 or 5%. But proportional representation seems to me to be ideal for a society like Israel. It may not be ideal for the UK, but for Israel, it seems to me to be great. Although the disadvantage, as I say, you don't know who you're voting for. You can't choose somebody and say, I want to vote for him or her. You're voting for a party list. So that's the disadvantage.
Yeah, and also share with us the important role that Israel's Defence Force plays in uniting the country, in being a melting pot for Israeli society, that all factions within Israeli society, whether Ashkenazi, whether Sephardi, whether religious or secular, whether rich or poor, can all merge into one united fighting force. And share with us how important that is for Israel's strength and stability as well.
Well, back in April we had Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day, but the previous day we had what's called Yom HaZikaron, which is the Remembrance Day for the soldiers killed and the people killed by terrorists. And something like maybe, I think, about some 24,000 people have died in the service of the country. And every family has had casualties, or they've had families close to them who've had casualties. We saw back in a couple of months ago, we saw Rabbi, of course, his family was decimated by terrorism. And the IDF is an amazing unifying force in Israel. New immigrants come to Israel and the IDF helps them with the language. It's a melting pot for the different strands of society, the Ashkenazim, the Sephardim, the Russians, the Arabs. I mean, Arabs don't have to enter the army, but they can voluntarily enter the army, and a lot do. And the religious Jews as well, more and more of them are entering into the army. So it's a great educational force. It's much more than a defence force. Friendships that are made in the army go on for life. And of course, many of Israel's leading politicians, including Netanyahu, have served with honour in the Israel Defence Force. And there are some incredible stories that come out from the Israel Defence Force as well. So yes, it's something which I think people don't understand. And a lot of on the left, a lot of left-wing people think that, you know, armies are something which are bad. You don't have to have an army. We'd be better off without an army. But if Israel laid down its arms, there would be no Israel. If the Palestinians laid down their arms, there would be peace, and that's the importance of the Israeli army.
Absolutely. And Golda Meir said that famous quote, didn't she? Reflecting upon that, share with us the story that you told me that you shared at your local shore about a taxi driver and his passenger, because I think a lot of our viewers get a lot of pleasure out of this.
Yes, I was asked to speak at the synagogue of my fiancée, and getting married soon.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I was asked to speak about Israel on the Sabbath, the Shabbat, between Yom HaShoah and Independence Day and Yom HaZikaron. And there was a very appropriate story which I picked up. There was the taxi drivers in Tel Aviv, they meet in each other's apartments or houses every so often, and they have a drink and a smoke and a chat. And there was one taxi driver who, he's told an incredible story. He'd just picked up a fare of a man who was dressed beautifully, and he had a very expensive cigarette lighter. He lit a cigarette, and the taxi driver noticed on his arm there was a number, tattooed number, which of course he was a victim of the Holocaust, and he was a survivor. And the taxi driver immediately committed this number to memory, and the taxi driver he was now religious, but he hadn't been religious previously, and he'd grown up on a kibbutz. And one day he was in the factory of the kibbutz where he worked, which was a factory with machines which sliced potatoes. And he wasn't feeling very well, and he fell into the machine slicing the potatoes. And he was scared he was going to get sliced up himself. And fortunately, there was a man from the kibbutz called Zalman who rescued him and pulled him out. And he owed his life to this man, Zalman. And he noticed on Zalman's arm there was a Holocaust number. And he committed that to memory. And he'd noticed something very important about the fare he was taking in the taxi. And immediately he stopped the cab, he turned around, he went in the other direction, and the passenger didn't understand what was going on. He was angry with him. He said, "What are you doing? You're taking me in the wrong direction." So the taxi driver was racing to the kibbutz where he was brought up. And he wanted to see if this man, Zalman, was still on the kibbutz. And he knocked on the door of the apartment where Zalman lived. And sure enough, Zalman was still there. And the passengers, the fare he took, had told him that he'd had a brother who was supposed to be in Israel, but people said he was dead. Sure enough, the numbers on their arms were different by one.
Wow.
And he was his brother.
Amazing.
And it's an incredible story of a reunion between two brothers, and only in Israel. It couldn't happen anywhere else.
Amazing. Jonathan, thank you so much for showing us that incredible, powerful story of two brothers uniting who went through the horrors of the Holocaust. And of course, that still today casts a dark shadow over the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. But on to the issue of the persecution of Christians within the Palestinian Authority, which we don't hear very much about, sadly. We don't have Christian organizations that raise awareness on the plight of Christians being persecuted across the Middle East really mention the persecutions happening under the Palestinian Authority. But just share with us the extent of persecution there is for Christians living within the Palestinian Authority.
This is something which is not covered by the media. And there's a huge contrast between the Christians in Israel, where there was a recent survey, 84% of Christians in Israel are happy with their lives. Israel is the only country in the Middle East where the Christian population is growing. A big contrast between that within Israel and the situation in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, where the population of Christians is falling rapidly. And we do occasionally get the reasons why that's happening from Christians, but they're always anonymous because they're scared. You know, people are scared of being called Islamophobic when they mention the reasons why the Christian population is falling in the West Bank.
Yeah, according to a recent publication for the Middle East Forum, according to Kamal Taziri, he's a Christian man who has fled from the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip in 2007, said the moment Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip, they started persecuting us, ruining our churches and forcing Christians to convert to Islam. He says before fleeing, Taziri tried to resist the Islamist takeover and called on Muslims and Christians to unite against Hamas. As a result, he was jailed for several times, he says. And you know that Hamas is a prison, but it's pure torture. It also then goes, the same article talks about how Christians have declined from 85% of the population of Bethlehem in 1947 to that of 16% in 2016. So clearly we're seeing here that under the Palestinian Authority, when it was established during the Oslo Accords of 1993, and then in 1994 we had the Jericho-Gaza Agreement, which Arafat became chairman of the PA. We saw an incredible persecution of Christians, particularly considering that Bethlehem is the birthplace of Christianity, where Jesus himself was actually born. We see that Christians are being persecuted and having to flee. But this amounts to ethnic cleansing, doesn't it? That's not even spoke about. And sadly, this is a topic that's not actually raised on.
There's a big contrast between what's happening within Israel and what's happening in the Palestinian Authority areas. Within Israel, there was a survey recently which said that 84% of Christians were happy with their lives. In the Palestinian Authority, of course, the Christian population has been declining quite rapidly. And Christians are scared to speak out about that because their lives are in danger. And the reports we do get are either from Christians who fled or from people who are anonymous and are careful to remain anonymous. And, you know, this is something which is underreported. People are even blaming within there was a report over Easter that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the media said that Israel was limiting the numbers of people who could enter the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So Israel got the blame. But of course, it was the authorities of the church who, for safety reasons, asked the Israeli police to limit the numbers of people going into the church. And of course the BBC misreported it and blamed Israel, which is what the BBC always does.
So Jonathan, share with us one of the reasons why we're seeing such persecutions against Christians living within the Palestinian Authority. Is it the rise of Islamism, or is it the fact that prior to the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 1994, that it was Israel's defense force that would actually protect the Christian minorities living in Judea and Samaria?
It's the rise of Islamism. Let's say Hamas in particular, we get allegations of mistreatment of Christians, allegations that Christians' freedom to worship is being restricted. And you don't see it in the media in a lot of cases because they're scared of being called Islamophobic, which is absurd. I mean, if the first way to deal with a problem is to acknowledge the problem exists, and unless you acknowledge that persecution of Christians in Judea and Samaria exists, unless you acknowledge that fact, and unless you acknowledge the reasons, you can't deal with the problem.
Yeah, I mean, according to my notes here, for example, confirm that Christians living under the Palestinian Authority are experiencing continual ill treatment, whilst the Muslim population doesn't. In 1947, Christians made up 85% of the population of Bethlehem, an ancient Christian stronghold. By 2016, Christians had declined to only 16% of the population. I'm sure now in 2023 that's even less. Said in a society where Arab Christians have no voice and no protection, it's no surprise that they are leaving. This is from Justin Reed Wiener, who's a lawyer equated to the region. So that does show, for example, that the Christian population is in peril within the Palestinian Authority, but also they're scared of the Palestinian Authority themselves, aren't they? Of speaking up against the corruption, speaking up against how their communities are persecuted and marginalised as well. And this contributes to this climate of fear that Christians are facing within the Palestinian Authority.
Indeed, and it's very sad. Israel is a country where all religions are free to worship. There was again controversy about the mosque, the Dome of the Rock, over Easter and over Ramadan, which coincided with Easter. People were blaming Israeli security forces for being heavy-handed, but the fact was Israeli security forces were preserving the right of people to worship in the mosque, and that we know that the mosque is used as a storage for stones, a storage for weapons, and there were youths who'd closed the mosque to worshippers, and the Israeli police were only doing their job, which is to keep the mosque open. So the reporting is completely topsy-turvy, and it's worse than that. There's nothing that incites hatred of Israel more than the lie that the Jews want to rebuild the temple and destroy the mosque. It's a complete lie, but every Ramadan we seem to get people who propagate this lie, and there's nothing which is guaranteed to inflame the Muslim population more than the lie that Israel wants to rebuild the temple and destroy the mosque. It's complete nonsense.
Yeah, and Jonathan, thank you so much for giving us a round comprehensive update on Israel, the Middle East, including your precious Jewish community here in the United Kingdom as well. But how can our Christian viewers get behind Israel, to support Israel, and also to support your Jewish community here in the UK?
Well, I think, write to your MPs when there's lies on the BBC. Write to your MPs about it. Protest. Support your local Jewish population especially when there are lies coming from the Church of England, which is not unheard of, and when there are hostile meetings in churches about Israel. Protest about that. We need more voices. We need more. We know that there is a big support among the Christian population for Israel. And the Hindu population as well, but sometimes they're silent, and we need to hear their voices. Especially, we have an election in the UK coming up as must be by the end of 2024, which is next year. Let's put the candidates to the fire. Let's see what their attitude is to Israel. Let's see what the Labour Party manifesto is on Israel, and let's vote accordingly.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for being my special guest on the Middle East Report this week, Jonathan. Done a great job, and congratulations on your forthcoming wedding, and continue your blogging, which is really important. So thank you. And I want to thank you for watching this program today. What stands out is that Israel is not only a beacon of light in a very dark region of the world, but it's also a beacon of truth. And we need to stand on that truth, which is biblical truth. So we want to thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.